Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Dr. Manzur Mohammed. I'm a co founder of Capacitas, and got with me Jeff Laborde, who's the CFO of JAGGAER. JAGGAER is a SaaS company that provides procurement services. And in today's very special event, we will be talking about how the CFO can become a change agent and make things happen. Um, just a few things about the audio event. First of all, the audio event will take about 45 to 50 minutes, depending on the number of questions we get. You can post questions, I believe, in the chat. I'll pick up those questions and we'll try and answer as many of those questions during the session. And a bit of background about our relationship. So a few years ago, we got introduced to JAGGAER, and I got introduced to Jeff when JAGGAER had started their journey into the cloud. And that introduction was via Cinven. At the time, they were the private equity firm that were looking after JAGGAER. From my working relationship with Jeff, I find that Jeff is actually, I would say, unique for a CFO in this space. He has the ability to ask the right questions and to make those things happen by asking those right questions. And I've been very impressed personally by seeing Jeff in action. And I've learned a lot of tricks from Jeff and those questions, and actually used some of those questions later on after seeing Jeff in action. And I thought it would be really great if Jeff, maybe you introduce yourself, and then we just talk about your experiences and how you come up with those questions to make change happen. Because from my personal experience, and I know from our other clients, actually making change happen in an organization that's gone to the cloud is really, really hard. So over to you, Jeff. Maybe if you give you a bit of your background, introduce yourself, and why you where you've built up that capability and thinking to ask the right questions.
Yes, thanks, Mansour. Pleasure to be able to spend time with you today and the audience. I've been looking forward to this for a while. It's a subject, cost management, but in particular for a technology company that has a sizable amount of spend dedicated to the cloud, to hosting. Very passionate about, as you know, and you've seen the passion many times.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So just by way of background, many years ago, I started actually as a CPA, very traditional for a CFO, but after a few years of working with one of, at the time, the big six audit firms, now down to the big four, I decided to go back and get my MBA at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania and transitioned out of accounting into more of a strategic investment banking role, first with Credit Suisse and then with Goldman Sachs out in San Francisco, banking tech companies for 12 years across the whole spectrum of investment banking products and services, of which where I spent most of my time was on the strategic mergers and acquisitions advisory side. So helping companies buy, sell, dispose, carve out, manage through liquidations in some cases, anti-raid defense. Very fun, very engaging. And it was in that role that I came across at the time, really the beginnings of what's transformed today into the larger software-oriented focused buyout world. You know, hundreds of billions of dollars being deployed to take software businesses private or never letting them get public in the first place with this whole middle and later stage investment class of private equity. and had a client of mine as a banker that I did a lot of work with who offered me my first CFO role. And that was Vista Equity. And that first role was about 13 years ago. And since then have had the pleasure to work with a number of firms in addition to Vista, Summit, Golden Gate, Cinven, most recently here at JAGGAER, Apex, Genstar, and very coincidentally, Vista again. I started with Vista, and Vista just acquired JAGGAER late last fall from Cinven, who hired me into the role about 5 years ago. So I've really enjoyed that.
Come full circle. You started at Vista.
Yes, I have to a degree.
Back to Vista.
Cinven, I think Cinven was a great experience for me. They have been newer to tech investing, but then coming back to Vista, as a first-time CFO, Vista was a great place. I learned a lot. They had a lot of structure that I benefited from. And then when I joined Cinven, JAGGAER, which was Cinven owned 5 years ago, JAGGAER was at a crossroads. It had gone through a pretty material M&A period of time, acquired a number of scale businesses, but needed a lot of integration. And one of the pivotal initiatives that we had was to take a business that basically had 23 different co-location centers for our cloud infrastructure across all of our products and cores and bring that to the cloud. And I had some great partners here at JAGGAER, our CTO. We hired a new head of cloud operations, gentleman who had come from a bigger business. And the three of us set about taking those 23 co-locations into the AWS cloud for us over the span of about a year and a half, which brought us together with Capacitus early in that relationship. So JAGGAER itself, aside from having 23 co-location centers, we're a mid-market procurement and spend management business that focuses on the full spectrum of supply, all the way down to procurement and payment, sourcing to payment, both direct and indirect. And we're a global business, have over 1,200 employees, operate across 50, 60 countries, with hosting in many different regions today.
Well, we've actually, one of our clients is one of the banks, big four banks in the UK, and they use the JAGGAER suite. So familiar with it from that perspective.
Very good. Always music to our ears, of course.
So I suppose then the question I have is, from our start of the conversations, our journey to the cloud, you seem to know the right questions to ask quite early on. Maybe you could just, what made you ask those right questions, and why are you so passionate about the cloud? I think maybe just give a bit of background on that.
Yeah, I think when I started with a SaaS business back in 2012, and we discussed using AWS, lots transpired in the last 12, 13 years. The cost at the time would have been absolutely prohibitive for my business, and we didn't really, beyond initial discussions, even consider it. But the progress that AWS and other cloud vendors, not just AWS, even though I'll continue to refer to them, have made in terms of their ability to offer at scale services that are so much more compelling and economical than we could ever offer on our own, unless we were a Fortune 500 business. Really, when you start to not just look at your core bit subscription costs that you might think of narrowly on an apples to apples basis and say, well, that seems kind of expensive, versus what I could get in a traditional colo where I'm doing CapEx and depreciating the equipment and running it out. If you start to layer in all of the additional efficiency, virtualization tools and services, security tools and services, monitoring tools and services, et cetera, that come with the AWS, and you start to pull those out, the economics make a lot of sense on the face of it. And so to grow and scale, whether you're big company, later stage, or early stage, venture back or founder-owned business, to grow and scale, I think the way that we knew we wanted to, both organically, growing our business, in the double digits, as well as via acquisitions on the M&A side. I think for my last couple roles, both JAGGAER and a prior one, it was a no-brainer. But that didn't mean it was simple. It was a no-brainer in the
Right.
sense that we knew we could benefit from it.
Uh-huh.
But I learned in the last couple of roles that really, unfortunately, it's a complicated enough process. It involves a lot of stakeholders. It's not just the cloud ops team, but a
That's
lot of
right.
stakeholders throughout the business, that to do it and do it right, I as a CFO had to take a very proactive role in helping the planning and the execution of that, really as a partner to the technical teams.
Actually, that you've brought up a couple of really important points. The first is the number of stakeholders who all have a role to play. So often what happens in the organizations, we see they say, oh, well, the cloud costs are high, and it's all put on the operations. Said, okay, sort it out. But it's actually the business, the product. They drive a lot of those costs because of their decisions on what products they put, what resilience, what performance they provide. So everyone's got a part to play in making sure that that cost profile is actually delivering value to the business. It is a good point. I think that the other thing I thought was quite interesting what you said is when you compare the cost of AWS to, say, a traditional on-prem model, we've looked in the past at other cloud providers who provide, effectively, they'll just provide infrastructure as a service. But they're missing things like the observability. They're missing, as you said, security. And so there's the cost comparison. It's not just on the pure compute or the hardware. It's all the wrapper around it, which makes it easier to manage or easier to scale up or easier to open new locations. So those are all really good points.
Direct and indirect, it's that classic indirect that a lot of traditional finance folks have a tough time with. It can be grayer, it can be tougher to quantify, but
That's right.
that is one vehicle through which I've found I oftentimes get pulled deeper into the operational side of the business, is following those threads of other ancillary impacts of a big decision like this, which to your earlier point of how do you think of the questions you think of, that's definitely one of the drivers.
So this one thing I remember from quite early on, we were looking at the cost profile, and I remember very distinctly the cost profile was going very up and down as things were migrated, and then there's some sort of corrective action. And I remember you saying that that's not good enough. That's not. At the end of the day, you're going to hit the number for the whole year, but why was it a problem seeing it going up and down? And I think that listeners will be interested for your perspective on that, because I found it very insightful. You basically said, look, it's unpredictable. You don't know what's making it go up. You don't know what's making it go down. Maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I had one of my early mentors teach me about, from a corporate standpoint, you have to know your business, simply put. And that isn't just you as a leader, it's your entire team and each of their roles. They need to know the business, their business, our business, as part of a team, as part of a company. And if now that one of the benefits of being in the cloud is that both through direct tools provided by the vendor, but also third-party tooling like Cloud Zero, Prosper Ops, all kinds of other services.
Cloud Health and so on,
Exactly, that are popping up. You have greater and greater visibility. What are you doing with that visibility? And to me, we were very methodical with the help of Capacitus, as you recall, Mansoor, where we started talking months and months in advance of making the move for planning. We
Yeah.
worked through the timeline of the multi-phased move to the cloud by geo, by product. And then once we were in the cloud, very, very importantly, we wanted to ensure that you were there helping us with execution post move, to ensure that, because cloud wasn't necessarily in our corporate DNA, that now being in the cloud, that it wasn't just viewed as, now, for the team, we're in a candy store and we can just start to get confused and my cost curve would accelerate. We expected our cost curve to flatten, where our incremental costs were coming down per every new dollar of customer revenue, recurring revenue, so that the scale benefits for us in the cloud translated into that marginal benefit. And when perhaps for us, the biggest risk, looking at that whole life cycle of the project, one would think might be turning the button and making the transition from colos into the cloud, but turning that switch and turning it on and not being up and running in AWS. But for us, the biggest risk I realized was after that, when a lot of things, everyday behaviors across managing that cloud environment, that we would do and not even think twice about when it was our own equipment and we were paying other vendors individually, you can now track every repercussion of those daily decisions, and their decisions by customer implementation, by a regional environment, by a product family, by a vertical, by geo, any and all of those, and those combined. And because you can track it, there's that saying, it's not what you expect, it's what you inspect. There was the need for so much inspection, and we were all learning it together. I realized that there was just this benefit in continuing to stay involved with the team that was doing the execution and learning with them, and making sure that we were asking all the right questions and assigning ownership for the responses to those questions. And using that tooling, that is a distinct positive of being in the cloud, because you have the ability to look at your spend in aggregate and break it down further and break it down further and break it down again, in a way that we could never do when we were in a colo setting. And so I think, just as I said earlier, following that through and just consistently, never getting tired of asking why.
I remember you used to drill down and kept on drilling down. I remember it very clearly and wanting to know the why.
Well, and I'm not a technologist. You're the experts in that regard. And we have other members of my team, very competent, capable folks. But I know enough from prior experiences, generically and specific to cloud, to try to leverage those repeatable patterns thematically. So I may not understand down to the bit and byte and down to this particular product and its technology and its code base and how that's set up versus others. But I do know that thematically, storage costs in the cloud are an issue, and that's not something you have to pay as much attention to in a colo setting where you're buying and depreciating storage equipment, as an example. And so if nobody's talking about storage and costs aren't necessarily going in the direction that you expect, poke and prod and ask until you get a satisfactory response. Actually,
you could view it as an overhead, having to constantly inspect, but the cloud is unforgiving for mistakes, because you get immediate feedback that you've made a mistake. But you could also view it as a positive. That inspection allows you the opportunity to constantly improve. It's almost like a muscle, exercising the muscle, and the next time you do it, you're going to be better. The next time you do it again, you'll be even better. So I think some organizations view it as an overhead, but actually it's a it's a huge opportunity to see how effective you are as a team in building services, running services.
Well, and especially to my point earlier on really where that being very clear and self-aware on where that team's coming from. We did not have but one person across a team of 45, 50 people who had experience with the cloud, who had experience in AWS. And I knew right there, even though we had very, very competent and capable people, it's one of those changes that it's not so unique, and we weren't so early on the curve that we were breaking new ground. And so we certainly realized we had to backfill with folks who had that experience to help bring that DNA to us as one vector, and then using someone like Capacitus as another vector who could help us with that cloud DNA, show us ideally the pitfalls, the holes, the gaps before we step into them as best as we could. And frankly, when we were to that point of living with the decision and actually executing on it with cloud, we started with a bigger team. It wasn't so big that that we lost accountability. I would say it was a little harder remotely, in the remote world than it might have been in my prior days where we had the core team and we were doing our weekly meetings together and in person. But it was a big enough team that we were all learning along the way, and everybody was hearing each other's questions and the issues. And to your point, where I was poking and prodding, most people started to learn that I had a repeating pattern, but that I wasn't going to be worn out or get tired of it. I was going to keep on asking those similar types of questions, the why, to where the team, before you know it, starts to do that for you. But you've got to continue to monitor it and track it along. And then we had the benefit of you all as a consistent guide and backstop along the way, who had done it before. And you all were, when we were interviewing firms originally, and I think this is a very important point of distinction, we had references to other firms, in particular, some of the bigger names that I would characterize as traditional consulting firms. And they were going to staff us up and help us with all the strategic planning and the guidance that we knew we needed to make this broader change a success. And I remember going through that process thinking to myself that there's something different about this move. My father, who's a doctor, used to say, there are those who can and do, and then there are those who teach. He never really loved his teachers. It's kind of a knock on teachers. And I sometimes think of consultants in that way. There are those who can and do it, and then there are those who consult. Implication being that they haven't or can or won't or don't do it. So no offense to consultants, because I've had some great consultants in my time. But we were looking for more than that. We were looking for a partner who was going to help us actually execute and be sitting in the seat next to us as well. And as I mentioned earlier, not just execute through the transition, but be here post-transition and help us learn how to live in the cloud. Not just get to the cloud, but how to live in the cloud, which I think was when the real fun started, frankly.
Yeah, that was where the fun started. That's a good point, actually. And our own personal experiences is that as a consultancy, you really need to deliver something that's actually material, because otherwise it's a PowerPoint. It's easy to ignore. But when it's real, alive in front of you, either it's causing you a problem or it's giving you a benefit, people can see it and they believe it, and then they'll embrace what you're saying. Just like what you were saying, Jeff, you keep on digging. Okay, now we find what the problem is. Okay, now I know that we have to keep on doing that in a regular cadence so that we don't make the same mistake again. I've actually got a question here, which I think is quite interesting. There's been a few stories in the press around firms repatriating workloads back in-house for cost reasons. Was wondering what Jeff's view is on this.
Yeah, I think life is never dull, and I remember when I was in university, one of the more interesting classes, because I actually remember it, was around broader investment and macroeconomic theory around black swan events, those events which shock the system, turn it upside down. And at the time, we were kind of told those happen like once every 20 or 30 years. Well, it feels like we're seeing a black swan event every 3 or 5 years now.
It feels like every day at the moment.
You're absolutely right, even more so. And so I think the moral of that is we all have to be flexible and receptive to evolving ways to do the business. We were hell bent on getting in the cloud. We still think of that as the strategy for the future. Frankly, we think it helps us future-proof ourselves to a degree because of the flexibility it gives us.
Yeah.
Anything that pulls back on flexibility, and I think of in-housing in many cases as doing that. Yeah, there may be a near-term cost benefit, but longer term, I talked about earlier, I can't compete with Amazon on spending and developing cutting-edge security technology. I can't compete with Amazon, same thing, on AI tooling and techniques and products and services. So why not benefit from them and all of their billions of dollars of research and investment by staying, with them or another cloud vendor in that setting? But I think centralization up until recently, speaking of kind of paradigm shifts in the cloud, because of the efficiencies and the scale benefits and everything that goes along with that, which, by the way, typically means a better service for the customer.
That's
and
right.
In software and in SaaS, it's all about customer success, truly. And the more centralization that we do, the better the product, the better the service, et cetera, is what we find. That is our experience. However, one thing that within the last year and a half, 2 years, it has changed dramatically is all of the sovereign data rights and how, as a global provider, it used to be fine to host everybody out of the United States. And 10 years ago, that started to evolve, and we started to move into regions, Europe and Asia and the Middle East. And so we did that. We set up locations in those regions, and that is similar to our AWS footprint today. Now we're seeing that actually devolve back into, in many cases, for, in particular, customers that have any connection to the government, whether they're direct public sector customers or providers to those public sector customers. We're seeing more and more countries say, no, you need to be in my customers to say, you need to be in my country to operate. So I do think that there's definitely, from the centralization focus, now a decentralization, at least as it relates to hosting footprint. But in terms of bringing more of that back in-house, I'd much rather keep it out as much outsourced and in the cloud as possible.
So that is interesting because there's a few interesting things. First is the black swan events, and we're living through it now. And the flexibility of a cloud is obviously to scale up, but it's also to scale down. And that allows you to manage risk. The other thing is just what you'd said there, sovereign cloud. Each, theoretically, you can make if you got the architecture right in the cloud, you can make a zero footprint, or like a very minimal footprint in lots and lots of different locations in the way you could never do in a data center. So there's a lot of benefits to the cloud, which makes, and I suppose it depends on your business model, which makes repatriation a riskier option, especially for the future, with there's so much uncertainty.
It certainly preserves flexibility, for sure, which we all know is key. Optionality, where you're just leveraging their scale, their footprint, et cetera. But the other facet of that evolution, especially from a CFO finance team perspective, that we structure my finance teams to, and this isn't transformational, I think this is pretty common, but we structure our finance teams to where individual members of the FP&A team, financial planning and analysis team, are assigned to and partnered with the corresponding functional groups. And so clearly there's a specific cloud operations team in alignment. And in order to try to ensure that we know how to adapt. I mean, this is important stuff, not just because without this, at a very basic level, we can't provide our SaaS offering to our customers. If it goes down, if it breaks, we've got nothing other than we're probably turning around and cutting checks out for rebates and warranty claims to customers. But also because it is a critical ingredient in our growth and expansion. You know, we can't grow without being able to provision and add more services to store more data, and to just support the business in that regard, geographically or otherwise.
Right.
And then from a pure finance, traditional CFO, it's my second biggest expense on my P&L.
Yes, that's right.
Behind labor. I mean, it's a software business. No surprise. Now, labor materially is outsized compared to this, but this is large as a category, number 2, and growing. And so I think you need look no further to say, well, that's darn strategic. And so if I'm going to be strategic as a CFO, then I have to make this my and my team's business. And so how do you do that? How do you operationalize that? What does that mean that I need to make it my business? Well, you remember, Manzoor, where we started with multiple meetings a week as teams on a specific project plan with a internal project management consultant that helped us run a SWAT team of people across the cloud ops team and with the finance team. We even had some development team membership.
I remember that, yeah.
And Capacitus hosted that. That's evolved and morphed, as I mentioned, to post-cloud implementation. Now the real fun starts to an internal team. Well, you all were there for the first 6 to 12 months after getting into the cloud, helping us understand the vital signs and what's important, what do we need to be looking for across all of the metrics and the data that we were getting that we had never had access to, that we now had access to with our AWS daily, weekly, monthly reporting. It took us a while to figure out what was important, what we wanted to review, but we are still now 3 years in meeting weekly with the CTO, the head of our cloud operations team, and myself as the 3 most senior level folks weekly. Sometimes we cancel the call. Sometimes we go over, 30 minutes, but we have the finance team. We have our cloud operations ops team member there. And then on occasion, we bring in other cloud ops leaders who we feel, as a situation may merit, we need their time, their explanations, their involvement, just to provide, as I talked about earlier, that inspection and that scrutiny. And we approach it with 2 elements to the discussion. The first is just a quick snapshot from my finance team members of where we are in that particular week trending, because we can track this data now weekly. We didn't used to be able to. We used to be able to only.
You can track it daily if you want.
We really could. We really could. I don't have time to meet daily, but darn it, I make time weekly to at least meet, because we can look backwards and forwards in real time to a degree where it used to be maybe you could meet once a month and you hoped you had the data for the backwards looking month, but you really had no idea what was going on now. And you had to guess what was coming going forward. But since we have all that data, there may come a day where I say this is no longer necessary, but we're still learning to live in the cloud in a way, not just that the cloud operations team is growing and adapting to, but also the engineering team, as a perfect example, is learning to adapt to. They may in the past have turned up instances that they did all their testing and development work on, and 5 different people set up 5 different instances. Nobody cared and nobody checked that. Nobody went around and looked to see if it needed to be turned off. Well, we had to put in place an entirely new set of protocols for the global engineering team on who can turn what on and when, how long it can stay on, and then who's checking back quickly, regularly on if it's still being used and if we can turn it off or stand it down. Just an example. But that meeting we set up into 2 primary discussion topics. And the first is that financial review, relative to budget and forecast at a little bit of a higher level. And it's not just the AWS expense line item. It's everything around that. It's the people costs. It's other tools and
the tools and
expenses, knowing that a lot goes into making up that cloud operations cost of goods sold line item for us. And then the second area is more of an operational review, where the cloud ops team and the operations person we have reports on a handful of metrics that are really look like the simple health check you get from a doctor, the EKG, with the line.
That's right, yeah.
We look at that across our major products, across cores, et cetera, and we see how things are trending. Of course, they've seen it, they've actioned it in most cases, but they're reporting out on it. They know C-level team members are asking about it and interested in it. And for me, that's a critical way to, if you don't show interest as a C-level, or whether it's me or the CTO or our chief of cloud ops, in most cases, that just won't flow down into the rest of the organization.
You're absolutely right. And that C-level interest will drive that insight and that inspection. Without that interest, there'll be no inspection, and there'll be things will be out of control. We've actually seen this happen in lots of organizations where there's not that interest from the C-level inspection. They're just worried about the top line. They're worried about keeping the service up. But actually, the cloud costs are a key part of making sure you meet the top line and that the service is behaving as expected. We've got quite a lot of questions here. I'm just going to pick out a few more. Now that spend is optimized, how do you ensure teams remain accountable for their usage? Have any systems you've implemented helped improves teams' governance when it comes to managing spend? I think we're talking about the process or any tools that you've implemented.
I think
easier.
I mean, qualitatively, I think that answer can differ more broadly on where you are as a business. Venture capital backed, super high growth businesses that are growing 50, 100+% top line a year. For them, optimization means something very different. It means support growth at all costs. It's like growth at all costs, GAC, as they say from a investment philosophy perspective or characterization perspective. And then you've got very mature, larger businesses where growth isn't the focus. They're operating at scale, and have a very different.
That's like your big enterprises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of that middle market, which is where a lot of private equity backed businesses are, which is where JAGGAER is, where you're trying to do both. You're trying to grow and capitalize on your scale to really optimize the profitability of the business, again, which is a big mantra for private equity. So I think that's an important consideration, number one, in terms of how you define optimize. Well, optimize ultimately is to support the stage at which your business is and what are your overarching goals, really. And then from there, the critical ingredient for us was to transition from a lot of the reporting, Manzoor, that you were doing to get us up and running. And this is that pro and con or danger zone of a consultant, traditional consultant, where they'll help you through or do on execution, but then they disappear and you're left with it. And if your team hasn't picked up on it, then you're potentially in trouble in your ability to maintain or further improve upon that change that you just went through. And a very effective tool for that, as I've already mentioned, was to keep Capacitus around post transition to the cloud in that post launch period, and help us as part of learning what's important to track, what's a red flag, how we jump on that, who jumps on that. And we did that in many ways, and we're better at it today in doing it ourselves because you did a lot of it for us and with us. In a way, again, that people who live it and breathe it, like you all do, are very comfortable with that, but it was new for us. And so once
Yes.
you get one, and when we show up with my team, with your team, and we do the review, and your team is answering the questions, articulating responses to spikes in usage that were unexpected, spikes in costs in certain areas, our team's seeing how you handle it, what you do. You take action. You don't just report. And here's how you take action. You go in, it down to perhaps, I'd say, what in that regard was the most surprising for any business to us, whether you're small, medium, or large, is how you all taught us. It's a rule we all know as finance professionals, but you all taught us how in the cloud, it can hit you over the head with a 2x4, where pennies make dollars and dollars make millions of dollars. And you might have this over here that's, oh, it spiked up and so left this light on in this corner, and that's only $5 a day. But if you see that small bad behavior, that small optimization across a number of areas, and over time, because you're on a toll model with a provider where you're paying for everything that you're using, bit and byte and everything else, those add up super quickly. And so effectively, no dollar was too small, no behavior, bad behavior was too small to not confront, discuss, and address going forward. And that is the hardest part to maintain, without a doubt. And I'm not saying we're perfect at it, but we are much, much better at it. And that is frankly where I, as a C-level executive, still at times have to get involved. Okay, we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago or a month ago. We're still talking about it today as an overrun or an inefficiency. Tongue in cheek, who do I have to go yell at, within your organization or within another organization to stop it, because I can see it. The numbers don't lie, and I can use that. Oftentimes it's simply taking that with an email and that data and letting it speak for itself, and that's adequate. But other times, our teams are busy. Nobody's ever staffed more than they would like and has free time. So you have to just really help them see the fact that if they don't put the stitch in time today, then as they continue to ignore it or delay in remedying it, the problem's just going to get bigger. There's a adverse multiplier effect. There's a positive multiplier effect. I don't want to just be negative of the cloud.
There's good growth and there's bad growth. So
that's right.
Knowing the difference is really important.
That's exactly right. If you don't address it now, if you don't nip it in the bud, then it just gets worse in the cloud.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a wee bit of there's an overlap when you're constantly snacking all the time, and you think, oh, it's just like one candy bar today, but like having it every day, it builds up over time and becomes a big problem. So, but then there's also good growth. If you're gaining weight and muscle and you're getting faster and stronger, now that's good growth. So knowing the distinction between those two types of cost increase is really important, because you want more of the good growth, but you want less of the bad growth. Actually, we've got another few questions now that the spend is. Once a company has made the initial move to cloud, how do you ensure cost optimization becomes an ongoing discipline rather than a one-time cleanup? Have you seen successful models for embedding this as BAU, and what role should finance play in that, sustain that role? I think you've covered some of that, but maybe how do you make it BAU? I think that's so it's no longer.
I mean, for me, it's again, you have to be careful because it's not always scalable. But for me, if it's important, then it merits my time. And so while I may not be able to attend every single meeting, we have a weekly that's moved to an every other week stand up, where we review, as I mentioned, the two parts, the financial focus, the model trending relative to then the ops focus. And we didn't have before an ops dedicated team focusing on recording and reporting that we now have, that we're in the cloud. That was a key set of roles that we had to hire and create. That was critical. and she speaks for that organization and is a critical member of the report out. But so that stand up and the week or every other week over week comparison of, are we addressing the trends that we need to address? Again, it's if we don't apply that time and effort, I haven't found a better way to just kind of assume, finish checking the right boxes, getting everybody running in the right direction, and just assuming that it's working. I have, and it's okay because it's the number 2 biggest spend, as I said, on my P&L. It merits my own personal time, my VP of Finance's personal time, showing up to these meetings on a regular basis, and asking the tough questions and ensuring that people, for better for worse, stay focused and accountable, and to the targets that we've laid out, and understanding the importance of meeting those. I also find, though, that you can make it a two-way street. It's not just you there hawking over them and kind of commanding and controlling. Oh gosh, I got to go talk to finance again every other week.
Yeah.
But I also find that it's very useful for the flip side of the flow of the feedback. It's not just kind of a finance, why is this more, why is this less, get it in line. It's understanding the why, as we touched on earlier. It's more trending this way or that, because then it allows you to pose questions back to the team. That I think the cloud ops team, the engineering and development teams, that let them provide you with more context for future planning. So we may have a budget, we may be focused on a near-term outcome, but if we're seeing trends of all different sorts, the data trend, the number of locations that customers are demanding and therefore sales needs us to host and to be in, all of those different product developments, compliance requirements that our product management now needs to put into the product, et cetera. You want to also have that flow of information back into this same forum. So it quickly can become more than just a finance meeting. It can become literally a cloud ops meeting, team meeting.
That is very true. So I view it that you get what I'd call housekeeping costs, mistakes, people leaving around and so on. But then you got the structural things, which are, as you said, driven by the product, driven by security requirements, driven by the business and new locations. And those are actually valuable because those aren't driven by cloud ops. They're just provision it as per what the business is requiring and what the business is doing. And having that conversation for between cloud ops and the business, it's actually useful conversation for cloud ops, and not just getting hit over the head for the costs being over budget. Now they're explaining, well, this is supporting the business. Maybe it's the right way, maybe you need it, but at the moment, that's the way we're working at the moment.
Well, and you have the ability to take every dollar of spend now and analyze it and break it up. We talked about Cloud Zero and Prosper Ops and tools like that help you break down the dollars, that help you get down to the individual products or customer level detail if you have to and need to. And sometimes you do. You may have someone who, for whatever reason, is massively abusing their storage capacity or allocated defined capacity. And that was much harder for me to track and monitor before being into the cloud. But all of those items are very operational. If you set up and move quickly beyond just keeping score to leveraging those insights to foster a discussion about, well, what next?
That's right.
It really gives you the ability, not just month to month, this week to next week, or this quarter to next quarter, to engage as a team in a way that is a bit more forward-looking than you ever could have before either. Again, where you're talking about new product releases, new compliance requirements, new geographic needs from the sales team.
That's right.
And that forward-looking view, I think, is enabling too, because the team then feels that they can approach that conversation a bit more openly than always coming in, with their tail tucked between their legs, because they're on the defensive. It's always just about costs. and managing those down. So it's gotten our conversation, our team meetings have gotten into a much more productive, balanced discussion. There's still some scary moments. There's still some things that pop out of line and you've got to jump on them. But if we aren't meeting to talk about it, everybody's busy and they're going to go their own way. And we'll wake up at the end of the quarter and we'll realize, a team or a product or something fell out of line. And it's not just about having the data, as we all know. It's about what you do with it and who does something with it.
I'm conscious of time. The one thing I really wanted to ask you is that, getting things or people to do things and making things happen is the toughest thing to do in a lot of businesses, especially if it's a larger organization, a more complex ecosystem. I'm interested in how did you handle some of the objections, or what type of objections you got for doing anything, and how did you handle those objections? How did you get people to actually act?
Well, the power of the purse goes a long way in terms of the finances. And so that is an important consideration. But you also, I think, have to have an element of emotional understanding and maturity of that team's leadership, the managers across that team. And you don't get that, again, by sitting in your office or just meeting a few people on Teams on occasion. You kind of, even though we mostly have to do it virtually today, I find you have to manage by walking around, do skip level engagements and discussions, invite those people who may not used to be in a forum like the one I described where we meet regularly to participate, and not just sign in, turn off their video, put it on mute, and do 5 other things at the same time, but call people out, pick them out, get their engagement and involvement. And doing all of that in a way where, assuming your incentives are aligned, whether you're an equity-based culture or a bonus-based culture, et cetera, but some incentives, effectively are tied to those outcomes, and making sure that it's far down into that team and that organization, that function, that you can make it. They understand how X is connected to Y, which results in Z outcome. You can't skip that and just start yelling about the costs. You've really got to allow them to see the big picture, but at the same time holding them accountable to the tactical step-by-step components that over time and across the organization, those thousands and millions of steps result in your ability to meet that larger goal. Unfortunately for us, rarely is a detail too small, because I always tell my teams as managers, if you have folks on your team that are getting the small stuff wrong, odds are they're not getting the big stuff right either. Right.
That is true.
It's usually just one element that bleeds into the other.
And the answer we often hear from the engineers is we don't have time. How do you kind of tackle that response? What's it?
I think as a leader, there are 2 approaches you can take there. One of which is, too bad, figure it out. That might be the Steve Jobs or the Elon Musk approach. When you read the bios of how they managed, they basically expect people to sleep under their desks and work 7 days a week to get to a product release deadline or just get something done. And that works for some companies and some cultures. You really need to find what works for you and your culture. But I think as a component of that, since I'm not Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, and I don't have the rapport to drive that kind of a result through fear and energy, or I've got to find other ways to do it. And really, I think a lot of that I tailor to the individual or the team. And if it's someone who is maybe new to my organization, new to the industry, new to a senior level role, I'll probably be a little more circumspect about when they say I don't have enough, and be a bit more enough resources, enough time, and be a bit pushier and try to drive more raw performance out of that, versus someone who for whatever reason, I have a real sense that, yeah, they are maxed out, that people are leaving late. Maybe they have higher turnover in that group.
Right.
And then in that scenario, again, I feel like this is one of those areas where you can define your persona as a leader. Are you the type that then says, oh, okay, well, let's sit down and talk about that. Bring me the list of other things and priorities, because I want to be a part of helping you potentially reprioritize. If you lay out 5 things, I may say this one in cloud ops of those 5 priorities that you're currently addressing is at the top going into the meeting. After that meeting, I may wake up and realize, oh my gosh, we have this international compliance requirement that we're going to get penalties and fined by if we don't meet it. Actually, that's number 1 priority, but then this needs to slide in as number 2. So let's mutually agree upon a timeline or a deadline. But if not, I'm not willing to have that conversation with them and go into that level of detail, which may mean I need to work late too to help get into that level of detail. Then it can make for a pretty difficult managerial situation, unfortunately.
We do see that. We're kind of getting close. Actually, we've slightly overrun, actually. I do apologize to everyone. So I'm going to have to close it. I didn't get to answer all the questions. I apologize for that. So first of all, Jeff, thank you very much. That was a really thoughtful and insightful responses. I think I'm sure the audience will find it very useful. And also thank you for everyone who's listening. I hope you find the audio event very useful, and I think the suggestions that Jeff has given and his experiences, maybe you can take some of them aboard into your own organization, have a discussion about them. It'd be great if you could maybe even feed back to us what worked and what didn't work, or maybe other things that we haven't discussed that have worked for you, because we're still learning as well. We're open to hearing new ideas.
Never stop. It never stops, right?
So,
the education process. Thank you, Manzoor, very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Cheers. Bye.